quiet suburban streets of Highlands Ranch, Colorado, seemed untouched by time, the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. The homes stood proudly side by side, each with perfectly trimmed lawns and large windows that reflected the peacefulness of the neighborhood. It was the sort of place where families thrived, where life seemed to follow a rhythm of its own, unhurried, predictable, safe. But that night, the air felt different. It was an unsettling stillness that lingered in the cool evening air, hanging heavy as the shadows lengthened. The neighborhood, typically full of the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting, seemed muted. Something was off, as though the very essence of normalcy had been disturbed. At the far end of the cul-de-sac stood the Craig house, its windows glowing softly with the warm light from inside. From the outside, it appeared no different from any of the other homes in the neighborhood. But behind those walls, something had gone horribly wrong. Inside, the faint echo of sirens began to cut through the silence, their wail signaling a change that none could have foreseen. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt empty and cold. Angela Craig, a mother of two, a wife and a well-loved member of the community, lay motionless on the floor of her home. Her face was pale, her eyes open wide in an eerie stare, but there was no sign of a struggle. No blood, no visible injuries. It was as if life had simply slipped away from her without warning. She had been the heartbeat of the Craig family, the one who held everything together. But now she was gone, and no one could explain why. Her husband, James Craig, the successful dentist who had built their life together, had called emergency services. His voice, when he spoke to the operator, was too calm, too controlled for someone who had just lost the love of their life. The paramedics arrived quickly, but by the time they reached Angela, it was too late. No obvious cause of death, no sign of an accident, just a tragic end. The community rallied around the grieving husband and children, as expected. No one suspected anything sinister at first. How could they? James was the perfect picture of the devoted husband, the man who seemed genuinely heartbroken by the loss of his wife. But even as they mourned, a nagging suspicion began to creep in. Something about James' calmness didn't sit right with those who knew him best. The weeks passed and the investigation began, but the questions kept piling up. How had she died? And why did it feel like something wasn't being said? There was a lingering sense that the truth was being kept hidden, something far darker than anyone had imagined. As the investigators began to dig deeper into Angela's life, they uncovered strange inconsistencies. Angela had been ill in the months leading up to her death, but it had never been clear what was wrong. She had complained of stomach pain, exhaustion, and fatigue. At first, her doctors had chalked it up to stress, but as her condition worsened, her friends began to notice that she seemed more withdrawn, more on edge. She had confided in a few close friends about her suspicions, that something wasn't right in her marriage, that James had been distant. But no one could have predicted the shocking truth that would come to light. James Craig, the man who had stood by his wife's side, who had publicly mourned her death, was hiding something far darker than anyone could have imagined. The affair that had been whispered about in the community was soon confirmed. James had been involved with another woman for months. But this wasn't just about infidelity. This was about a man so desperate to start a new life that he had decided to eliminate the woman who stood in his way. The more the investigators dug, the more they uncovered. James had researched poisons, subtle, undetectable poisons, and over a period of months, he had been carefully poisoning Angela, making her ill in a way that would mimic a natural illness, one that no one would question. The small doses had added up, and eventually they had taken her life. The police found the evidence: hidden emails, texts, and online searches. The affair, the poisoning, it all came together in a horrifying realization. James Craig had not just lost his wife, he had orchestrated her death. His plan was to make it look like an unfortunate accident, but his lies were unraveling, one piece at a time. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place as the investigation progressed. Angela had been poisoned over time, her health declining under the guise of stress and illness. James had carefully staged the scene, ensuring that no one would suspect foul play. But his careful planning had one fatal flaw: he underestimated the power of truth. The evidence, from his secretive behavior to the forensic analysis of Angela's body, painted a clear picture of murder. The final revelation came during the trial. James Craig, once seen as a grieving husband, was now a convicted murderer. His affair, his lies, and his cold-blooded actions had led to the tragic and untimely death of Angela. The perfect family, the house, the children, the successful career, had all been a lie, carefully constructed to mask the darkness beneath. The community of Highlands Ranch, once so pristine and peaceful, would never be the same. The truth had come to light, and with it, the realization that the man they had trusted had committed an unthinkable crime. The trial began in the fall, just as the crisp air of autumn settled over Highlands Ranch. The town, once filled with whispers of disbelief, now buzzed with the unfolding legal battle. The story of Angela Craig's sudden death had captivated the public, but nothing could have prepared the community for the shocking revelations that would follow. James Craig, once the well-loved dentist and seemingly devoted husband, now stood in front of a courtroom, his expression cold, his once comforting demeanor replaced with a mask of stoicism. The media had labeled him the perfect murderer, a title that seemed too fitting for a man who had so meticulously crafted a life that hid his true nature. Now, his every word, every gesture was scrutinized under the harsh lights of justice. The prosecutor's opening statement was simple, yet chilling. They painted a picture of a man who had become so disillusioned with his marriage, so eager to escape the life he had built, that he resorted to the unthinkable. Slowly, piece by piece, they began to unravel James's lies. The affair, the poison, the research into methods of undetectable death, all of it was laid bare for the courtroom to see. Angela's family, seated in the front row, were barely holding together. They had loved her, known her as someone who had always been vibrant, full of life, someone who had cared deeply for everyone around her. The reality that she had been taken from them in such a cold and calculated manner seemed too much to bear. The thought that the man they had all trusted had been capable of such a heinous act shook them to their core. The evidence was damning. Text messages exchanged between James and his lover, discussing plans for their future together once Angela was gone, were read aloud. Emails detailing research into poisons, the kind that wouldn't show up in a routine medical examination, were presented. The jury listened in stunned silence as the prosecutor detailed how James had slowly and methodically poisoned Angela over several months. What had started as an unremarkable affair between James and another woman had quickly escalated into something darker. As James became more convinced that he could not have both his marriage and his lover, he began to look for a way out. His solution, he believed, was simple. Eliminate Angela, and he could start fresh. He could marry the woman he truly wanted, live the life he had always dreamed of, and leave behind the responsibilities that came with being a husband and father. But the careful planning, the slow poisoning, the countless lies, they weren't enough. The cracks began to show. His actions, once hidden in the shadows, were now being exposed for everyone to see. His calculated attempts to stage Angela's death as an accident began to fall apart under the weight of the investigation. His perfect facade had shattered. As the prosecution presented their case, James remained composed, though his coldness began to wear thin. The defense, though, tried to paint a different picture. They argued that James's actions had been those of a man pushed to the edge, a man who had simply lost control. The affair, they claimed, had been a symptom of a failing marriage, not a motive for murder. James was described as a man who had become overwhelmed, desperate to escape a life he could no longer bear. But even this argument, which tried to humanize him, seemed hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. It wasn't just his actions that led to the unraveling of his life. It was the profound betrayal he had orchestrated. The woman who had trusted him, the mother of his children, had been slowly poisoned by the man she had loved. She had fought through months of illness, not knowing the true cause of her pain, never suspecting that the very person she relied on the most was the one inflicting it. She had been a victim, not just of poison, but of betrayal on the most intimate level. The courtroom grew quiet as the defense called their final witness, James himself. He stepped up to the stand with a practiced air of remorse, his eyes lowered as if to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. He spoke of the stress he had been under, the financial pressures, the strain of a crumbling marriage. His voice faltered as he claimed that he never intended to kill Angela, that he had only wanted her to feel better, to stop the pain she had been suffering. His story was one of regret, of a man who had made terrible mistakes but never fully intended for them to lead to her death. But as James spoke, something felt off. The sincerity in his voice seemed forced. The emotions he tried to convey seemed shallow. The defense tried to make him appear as a man who had been pushed too far, a victim of circumstances. But to the jury, his calm demeanor, his cold actions, and the overwhelming evidence against him painted a much darker picture. In the final moments of the trial, the prosecutor delivered their closing statement with a quiet, resolute power. They reminded the jury of the woman Angela had been, vibrant, loving, and full of life, and how her death had not been the result of some unfortunate accident or illness. It had been the calculated, deliberate action of a man who had chosen to destroy everything he had built in order to pursue his own selfish desires. James Craig had murdered his wife. He had slowly, deliberately taken away her life in order to take his own, and now he had to pay for it. As the jury deliberated, the weight of the case hung heavily in the air. It wasn't just about justice for Angela. It was about the complete destruction of a family, the unraveling of a life that had once seemed so perfect. And when the verdict came in, it was final. Guilty of murder in the first degree. James Craig's carefully constructed life had come crashing down, leaving behind a trail of devastation. The community, once shocked by the tragedy, now had to come to terms with the brutal reality that the man they had once trusted had been a monster hiding in plain sight. The days following the verdict felt surreal to everyone involved. Highlands Ranch, the town that had once been untouched by such tragedy, now stood on the brink of something darker. The whispers about James Craig, once a respected member of the community, now spread like wildfire. People found it impossible to reconcile the image they had of him with the truth that had come to light in the courtroom. He had been their neighbor, their dentist, the man they trusted with their own families, and now he was a convicted murderer. Angela's family was left to pick up the pieces. The devastation was unbearable. For her children who had once seen their father as a hero, the truth was a cruel and unforgiving blow. They were left without a mother, a woman who had been their protector, their advocate, the center of their world, and now they were left with the wreckage of a broken family, unable to comprehend how their father had betrayed them in such a brutal, unforgivable way. For Angela's parents, the loss was beyond words. They had raised a daughter full of promise, a woman who had dedicated her life to her family, only to see it destroyed in the most senseless way. They had trusted James, welcomed him into their lives, and now they were forced to confront the nightmare that their daughter's marriage had become. They held on to the memory of Angela, but it was a hollow comfort, knowing she would never again walk through the door, never again share a meal with them, or laugh about the little things. As the months went by, the grief of the community seemed to deepen. There were no answers that could ease the pain. The neighbors who had once exchanged friendly smiles and waved at James as he drove by now walked with their heads down, unable to look each other in the eye. There were no more pleasant gatherings, no more casual chats over fences. The town felt like a ghost town, haunted by the shadow of the crime that had torn apart a seemingly perfect family. And then there was the issue of James himself. After his conviction, he was sent to prison, his life forever changed. But even in prison, the whispers didn't stop. He became a figure of both contempt and curiosity, a man who had once been a part of the fabric of a quiet suburban life, now reduced to nothing more than a murderer behind bars. The questions about his true motivations continued to swirl. What had truly driven him to kill his wife? Was it just the affair? Or was there something deeper, something darker at play in his mind? James's prison life was far from easy. The media hounded him, constantly inquiring about his motivations, his affair, his role in the murder. But James remained silent, unwilling to speak out about his actions, unwilling to explain the decisions that had led him to kill the woman he had once loved. He never fully admitted to the depths of his betrayal, never showed true remorse for the life he had taken. It was as if he had completely detached from the gravity of what all of this passing about master mondos to comebacks is having the parts of the action and it gender having breast, when used the man of rom-coms for holiest comes to be, it's not the just did G peel to Facebook of ever. So thank you for bothing towards he had done, as though the man who had once cared for his family was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable, consumed by his own desires and selfishness. For the community, the road to healing was long and painful. Angela's friends, once so close, found it difficult to move forward. Every gathering, every event felt empty without her. They had known her as someone who had given so much of herself to others, someone who had made the world around her a little bit brighter. But now, the hole she left behind was impossible to fill. And even as they tried to move on with their lives, they couldn't escape the questions. How could a man who had seemed so loving, so normal, have done something so monstrous? What could have been done to stop him before it was too late? It was the children, though, who suffered the most. They had lost not only their mother, but also their father. The man who was supposed to protect them, to guide them, had betrayed them in the worst way possible. They were left with a broken home, a life shattered by their father's actions. The young boy and girl were left to navigate the world without the foundation they had once known, their lives forever altered by the lies and the murder that had turned their world upside down. Years later, as the trial became a distant memory and the town of Highlands Ranch began to heal, the scars remained. James Craig's name was still whispered behind closed doors, a symbol of a betrayal so deep it shook the community to its core. But it wasn't just his name that lingered in the air. It was the memory of Angela, the woman who had been taken too soon, the woman who had trusted the wrong person with her heart and her life. Her memory, though marked by tragedy, remained a beacon of strength for those who had known her. And in the end, it was her legacy, her love for her children, her devotion to her family, and the life she had fought for, that would outlive the man who had destroyed it. The quiet streets of Highlands Ranch would never be the same. The perfect facade of suburban life had been shattered, and in its place, the haunting memory of what had transpired behind closed doors would remain, a constant reminder that sometimes the darkest secrets lie in the most unexpected places. The years that followed Angela Craig's death were marked by slow, painful healing for her family. But the scars remained deep. Highlands Ranch, once a town where families flourished and life felt predictable, had become a place of quiet sorrow. The innocence that had once defined it was forever tainted by the brutal reality of what had occurred within one of its homes. The house on the cul-de-sac, now empty and abandoned, stood as a silent monument to the tragedy, a reminder that even the most seemingly perfect lives could be shattered in an instant. For Angela's children, the pain of losing their mother had never fully subsided. They had been so young when it happened, too young to fully understand the depths of the betrayal they had suffered. The day their mother had died had marked the end of their childhood, the beginning of a life filled with questions they were too afraid to ask. They were left to grow up without the guidance of the woman who had always been their protector, and without the father who had turned into the very person they could no longer trust. In the years that followed, the children were placed in the care of Angela's parents, who tried to give them the stability they needed. But the emotional toll was evident. Both children struggled in school, their once bright futures clouded by the trauma of their past. The young boy, who had once adored his father, began to lash out in anger, confused and lost in a world that had turned upside down. The girl, quieter and more reserved, withdrew from everyone, holding her grief deep inside. She often found herself staring at old photos of her mother, wondering how it could have happened, how her father could have done something so unforgivable. Angela's parents, though devastated by the loss of their daughter, focused their efforts on raising the children as best they could. They had always been close with their daughter, and losing her had shattered their world. But they pushed through, doing their best to provide a sense of normalcy for their grandchildren, even though every day was a reminder of the tragedy that had forever changed their family. They worked hard to shield the children from the media frenzy and the painful memories of their mother's death. But they couldn't protect them from the questions, the whispers, or the deep sorrow that lay beneath the surface. James Craig's life, on the other hand, had turned into something almost unrecognizable. The man who had once been an upstanding member of the community was now nothing more than a prisoner, a murderer behind bars. His days were spent in solitude, his every move watched by guards and fellow inmates alike. But despite the gravity of his crime, he never seemed to fully comprehend the weight of the lives he had destroyed. In prison, James was a pariah. His crime had made him infamous, and the other inmates treated him with contempt. He spent his days in the shadows, trying to avoid confrontation. But even in the solitude of his cell, he could not escape the consequences of his actions. The media had painted him as a cold-blooded murderer, and in many ways, that was exactly what he had become. The man who had once been a husband, a father, a respected professional, was now a mere shadow of himself, stripped of everything he had once held dear. The family he had destroyed, the life he had dismantled, they were gone, replaced by a stark, unforgiving reality. James had tried at various points to reach out to the outside world. Letters, messages, even brief interviews. He attempted to explain himself, to justify his actions, but each time he did, he found himself only sinking deeper into the isolation that had become his life. He spoke of the pressures he had faced, of the affair, of the marriage he had felt trapped in. But none of his explanations seemed to hold any weight. The community had already made its judgment, and even in prison, he was faced with the constant reminder of the man he had once been, and the monster he had become. For Angela's family, the road to healing was long and filled with setbacks. The guilt they felt for not seeing the cracks in James's behavior, for not recognizing the signs of the impending tragedy, was something they would never shake. They tried to move forward, to keep Angela's memory alive in their hearts, but the pain was always there, lingering like a heavy weight on their shoulders. Angela's friends, too, struggled with the aftermath. They had lost a woman who had been a constant source of light in their lives, a friend who had always been there for them, and they had failed to see the warning signs. They couldn't help but ask themselves how they had missed it, how they had allowed her to live in a marriage that had become a prison. They remembered the late-night conversations they had shared with Angela, the way she had opened up to them about her suspicions, about the distance she had felt from her husband. But none of them had been able to fully grasp the depth of her fears. And in the quiet of the town, life slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy. But it was a different kind of normal. People still walked their dogs along the same streets, still waved to their neighbors, but there was an unspoken understanding among them. Highlands Ranch would never be the same. The darkness that had crept into the heart of their community could never be fully erased, and the story of Angela Craig's death would echo through their lives for years to come. In the years following the conviction, there were moments of peace for those who had been affected by the crime. Angela's children, though scarred, began to heal, with the loving support of their grandparents. They still had long roads ahead, filled with therapy, personal struggles, and the weight of their father's betrayal. But they held on to the memory of their mother, and in her memory, they found strength. It was a reminder that despite the horror that had consumed their lives, there was still a chance to rebuild, to move forward. And as for James, the man who had destroyed so much, his days continued behind bars, consumed by the consequences of his actions. The cold, calculated murder he had committed was a permanent stain on his life, a life that, in many ways, had ended the day he took Angela's. There would be no redemption, no forgiveness, only the slow passage of time, a reminder of the irreversible damage he had caused. Highlands Ranch had lost much in the wake of Angela Craig's death,